My name is Paul Sherman, and I'm the Director of Programs for SID-W. So first and foremost, I want to thank our speakers today, Judith and Ella, for speaking with us in the SID community. We appreciate them taking the time out of their busy schedules to speak with us about this important topic. I also don't want to leave out the other two folks who are listed, who are spotlighted here, our wonderful workgroup co-chairs, David and Deepa, who helped put this event together. Thank you for your support as always and making this possible. So I don't want to take up too much time plugging SID, but I do want to mention that we do have many events. We do have a few more events coming up. One tomorrow, and two the following week, and then one the following week, and then one probably more the following week. So check out our website for more updated information about our upcoming events. They all are going to be really interesting and robust conversations. And speaking of robust conversations, we have our annual conference coming up in I'm a little bit it's coming up quickly for us. It's on May 26th and 27th. More information about that's on our website, so check that out. And you'll see everything that's going on with that. We should be announcing the theme, if we haven't done so already, fairly shortly, along with many other pieces of the conference. So check out our website for that. And that's enough of that. I do want to mention a few different pieces about today's event. As you may have noticed already, we are recording today's event. So that's something that we will be doing also in the breakout rooms. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then the other piece is on the structure of this event. This is a little bit different than what we've done in at least recently. So to start, David and Deepa will go over just some background information about the event. And then after that, Ella and Judith will both have short presentations that will lead into then breakout rooms where you'll be able to just have a group conversation moderated by both of the co-chairs, one on urban wash and the other on affordable housing. You will be able to self-select into those rooms, and that will become available later on in this discussion about maybe in about a half an hour. And then at the very end, we'll come back as a full group and just discuss some of the key takeaways from the conversations that you had, and that will be that. And with that, that's enough of me talking. I will hand it over to David and Deepa to get us started and to provide the framework for today.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon. My name is David Painter, and I'm co-chair of the SID Infrastructure and Urban Development Workgroup. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our workgroup's first truly interactive event, where we plan to discuss private sector engagement in urban development in the context of affordable housing and water and sanitation services. So after introductory remarks by our guest speakers, Judith Hermansen on the subject of affordable housing and Ella Lazarte on water and sanitation services, you'll be able to join a breakout session for discussion of one of these topics. Specific directions for selecting a breakout room for the discussion will be provided in the chat box, so you should continue to monitor that. And we hope that everyone will enjoy sharing their ideas and experience with private sector engagement related to their chosen topic. Engagement of the private sector in the creation of affordable housing in developing cities is absolutely essential, and it can take many forms. It can involve planning, financing, and/or construction of housing. It may involve formal housing development firms, construction firms, and specialized housing finance companies, but it may also involve informal builders, microfinance lenders, and the very families who are living in informal neighborhoods. So, who is the private sector? How can they be encouraged to deliver affordable housing? And what is affordable? I hope we will have a rich discussion of these and other questions during our breakout session. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and former SID colleague, Judith Hermansen, who's president and CEO of IHC Global, a leading nonprofit research and advocacy group for the importance of housing in urban and global development. IHC Global advances practical solutions raises awareness about issues, and advocates for equitable urban development worldwide. You can find Judith's biographical information on the SID website for this event, but I imagine that she is well known to many of you who have worked in the housing and urban development field in the past. At the conclusion of Judith's presentation, my co-chair, Deepa Kenan, will introduce Ella Lazata, our other guest speaker. Now, Judith, over to you.
Unmute is always the the first task, right? And so thank you so much, David, and also Deepa and Sid Washington for the invitation to speak with you all today, and to help to establish a framework perhaps for our discussion in the smaller groups. I was excited to be invited because this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, but also because it is built to be not just talking heads, but interaction among all of us. So I hope to learn from you, and I hope that you will be sharing some of your own experiences and observations, so that at the end of this session, all of us have gained some new and important insights into how to address this, this very, very complicated problem. And I see my role here, and what I have structured a few slides to do is to kind of provide context, as well as to get us onto the same page rather, as to how and when the private sector can more systematically and systemically be engaged in the delivery of affordable housing. And as David alluded to in his introductory remarks, there are complications within complications here. I don't intend to get into a lot of definitions or anything, but I do think it's helpful to clarify some of the terms and what it is that we're talking about. Thank you. For the next slide. What is that complexity? Well, what is housing? What is affordability? What is informality? What is sustainable urban development? What is the private sector? We're talking about all of those, and we probably all know each of these, as they say, when we see them, but they mean different things in different circumstances. So affordable housing is a term that we all may think we understand, but it's actually manifested in many different ways in many different countries. So I think that that's really important for us to keep in mind. There is no, I'll say at the outset, sorry if I'm disappointing any of you, there is no one size that fits all. However, there may be, and I'm going to try to have us be at a 50,000 foot level a little bit before we zoom into, as it were, into specific examples of things that have worked or that have not worked. So I'm going to go through a series of slides that addresses each of these elements. Next slide, please. So housing is not an island. I think that we often think about housing as just houses that are developed somewhere, or maybe most of you don't, but many people would do that. However, housing is produced and delivered within a comprehensive strategy, whatever that is, and it involves the private sector, governments, local and national, civil society, and community. Sometimes the strategy is explicit, sometimes not, but all of these actors are normally involved. It is also deeply intertwined with the prospect of shared prosperity and urban service delivery. So when we say greater private sector engagement, we're not saying to the exclusion of other actors. Housing at the heart of everyone's life is connected physically and socially to the context in which it exists. So delivering affordable housing is not simply a matter of enabling low-cost greenfield development and new construction, as some people might like to think about it. In fact, in many cities around the world, maybe most, that's not really feasible, even if it might make for a straightforward investment opportunity. So we're not really talking only about the construction of housing when we're talking about private sector involvement, although that it could be very much an important element of it. So within this system, there are tensions and trade-offs that are going to be necessary. Next slide, please. So according to the UN, only 13% of the world's cities have enough affordable housing. It is a problem that's shared across the global north and the global south. Next slide, please. So further estimate is that by 2050, 2.5 billion people will be without adequate housing, or should we say affordable housing. The UN defines unacceptable housing as that which lacks one or more of the following: a durable structure that protects from the climate elements, access to clean water, improved sanitation, secure tenure, whether ownership or occupancy, sufficient living space, no more than 3 persons per room. And so there are billions, literally, currently, and are projected to be more in the near future, who do not have this. So affordable housing, meaning not just a structure or a place to live that you can afford, but something that meets the criteria of what I'm just going to call here, for simplicity's sake, decent housing. So next slide, please. What is affordability? I think in the most simplistic terms, often we think, how do I buy it, or can I afford the rent? And that's certainly part of it. But the other part is the cost to keep the house. And then there are other intangibles that come into this, such as the cost of commuting and other things that would add to your burden of where it is that you live. So it's a complex, even though it sounds easy, it's a complex formula. Next slide, please. Making it more complex, and I will not begin to go into this here, but there are different places, different ways that people calculate what affordability means. I think what we're really talking about here in very basic terms is what you can afford to pay for, maintain, and live in with sufficient financial resources to sustain your health and well-being and that of your family. Affordable housing often, usually, assumes subsidy and/or government-supported or enabled delivery. This is the case in many countries, including our own. But does it have to be? And what role does the private sector play in that? And at what point, if there are enabling features by government, what is it at the level of sort of taxation, financial policy, fiscal policy, or other things? And that's something that I think we will hope to explore during our breakout session. Are markets forces sufficient to provide for affordable housing? You can get into great debates, maybe we will today, about that topic alone. Next slide, please. So what we're also really talking about today, I believe, or I'm trying to focus us on, is affordability, affordable housing, affordable, decent housing within the shadow and dynamism of informality. On the one hand, many countries around the world, cities around the world, have large portions of their populations living informally. And this occurs when demand outstrips the ability to supply. So the supply system doesn't work, or the laws and regulation do not work. And they have not permitted the residents to live within the formal system. On the other hand, they are, as David was mentioning, they're privately built. They're the energy and the enterprise of the people who live there, and informal enterprises as well. So when we talk about the private sector, rather, should we be embracing the informal sector as well? There are schools of development that think that we should just go to the informal sector because that is overshadowing and taking is a preponderant force in many places in the world. How do we accommodate that? How do we understand it? How do we incorporate that energy? And on the other side of the coin is how is the formal private sector engaged with, how can they be, should they be engaged with better housing delivery. Next slide, please. And this is very important, as that picture illustrates, and as we probably all know, large numbers of people live in these conditions. In Africa, as more than 50% by some estimates, something like 1.3 billion people. Similar numbers also in China and India and other parts of the world are coming up to large numbers living informally, and there are varied conditions within that. But how do we engage? Are we talking about the private sector within that context as well? Next slide, please. One could argue, and maybe I would also, that the informal sector mirrors the formal private sector, in the sense of housing delivery is housing delivery. You need certain things. You need construction. You need land. You need sort of permissions of some sort. You need a design. You need money, and you need all of these things, whether you're working informally or formally. And just anecdotally, I hope not overstepping my time here, once upon a time, I did a lot of work in cooperative housing. And in Kenya, for example, there was a new law about enabling cooperative housing. And almost every person I seemed to meet was a member of a cooperative. And they somehow thought that being a member of the cooperative was going to enable them to jump over all of these elements that needed to be there. So I am being reminded that I shouldn't dwell on my anecdote, but I think that it's really important to understand that when we're saying private sector, we mean any one of these actors here, and each is important. Next slide, please. I believe that one key, perhaps, to engaging at least the formal private sector is the property market and the security of tenure and the confidence in ownership that can provide if it is constituted. And what I have there in a slide is just a tool that IHC Global uses to assess the workings of property markets. And it's not just buy and sell. It has to do with the credit, with land tenure, property rights, and a whole bunch of other things that I do not have time to really go into here. Next slide, please. Property rights are fundamental, however, and they must be in place, I think, to support anybody investing, even in informal settlements. Anecdotally, we know people and even backyard landlords, if you will, invest in their property when they do not fear eviction, or that their rights are going to be, their understood rights to occupancy will be observed. So. And then next slide, please. I'm racing through the last two because there's a lot of information here. And Larry, I'm very glad you're here and you will recognize this slide. IHC Global has done a lot of work on affordable housing and where we think things work and that they don't work. And this is a slide that is based really on Larry's work with some of our other senior technical advisors, that shows the elements that we think are really critical to affordable housing. The real estate industry, property markets are very important. Housing finance, very important. Infrastructure, very important. All of those are areas in which the private sector can play a role. So thank you very much. I have my last slide, which I maybe will show when we get into the working group, some questions if we need them to kick us off in our discussion. I hope that within the context of this broad framework that I have provided, that we will have specific examples and begin to fit them within that framework so that we emerge from this session with a greater understanding of what works and how it has worked and how it has not worked within the broad framework. Because in order for there to be systemic and systematic change that engages the private sector, it needs to work within a comprehensive strategy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. That was fantastic. And this is one of the reasons we should do more sort of sessions on sectors within urban and sort of bring folks from housing, from urban planning and water and sanitation, sort of together under common groups, because we don't do this enough. And as I know you've had to rush through that slide on interventions, Judith, but I was just looking at it and I said so much of what was listed there possibly resonates with several of us in the water and sanitation sector as well. Thank you so much. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're all joining from. My name is Deepa Karthikeyan. I'm Director, Urban Governance and Service at Athena Infonomics, and I co-chair the Infrastructure and Urban Development Workgroup with David. We're very excited to have with us today Ella Lazate from USAID. I'm going to take a quick minute to introduce Ella because she has a fascinating background. Ella is Senior Water and Sanitation Advisor at USAID's Center for Water Security, Sanitation and Hygiene in the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. She leads the agency's private sector engagement and finance work and supports the design, implementation, and monitoring of water and sanitation programs in missions across the world. What's also particularly fascinating about Ella's background and experience is that she did spend a decade at the World Bank supporting pro-poor policy and institutional and regulatory reform. And, you know, USAID and the World Bank has somewhat distinct sort of priorities on PSC, and maybe Ella, it'll be lovely to hear more about that as you present and share in the breakouts. Ella has a bachelor's degree in political economy from Berkeley and a master's degree in urban planning, and will share with us today USAID's priorities and approaches on PSC. Over to you, Ella.
Thanks so much, Deepa. Thank you so much for the invitation. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to spend just a little time with you, just to speak a little bit about what we're doing at USAID, and also really hear from you in terms of what you're doing. I am most of the time, especially given the pandemic, stuck at my desk designing programs and conceptualizing and writing strategies and talking to some of you, but really not enough time spent really getting a lot more information from others. So looking forward to that discussion. And I really do also want to say, as Judith was presenting, I was nodding my head thinking, wait, so that slide could also be used with a few revisions for WASH. And so there are really a lot of synergies. I spent over a year and a half in Rio, actually, as a Fulbright scholar many years ago, working in the favelas. And so that's, there's been a lot of work going on in terms of really improving basic water and sanitation services through slum upgrading programs, through housing programs in Brazil and elsewhere. So that was sort of my first forays into this space a long time ago. Next slide, please. And so I took a different tack here. Instead of providing the challenges and framing, I will just take you through a tour around the world to give you a sense of what USAID is doing, and perhaps through these cases and a lot of our interaction in the breakout groups, you will get a better understanding of what we're doing and some of the high-level strategy around it. So case number one. Supporting public-private partnerships in secondary cities in Mozambique. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. I've been working in Mozambique since 2005, off and on, back when I was when I was at MIT and then the World Bank and then now at USAID. So it's been a long process, really trying to engage the private sector in water and sanitation there, particularly in secondary cities. So as many of you know, probably in this audience, but not everybody, there are 2 billion people with no access to safely managed water around the world, and 4 billion without access to safely managed sanitation. So those are the numbers we have to deal with, plus 114 billion people needed just for capital investments alone. Forget operations and maintenance and the daily running of these water service providers or sanitation providers. So these are big figures that we have to deal with. And so we know that water in general is seen as a public good for people. It's very political. It's a public social and economic good. People have to pay for it if they want it to last a lifetime and continue the services. But it's not always the case. So those are some of the challenges that we see in terms of increasing and expanding private sector participation in the sector. There's low public spending, tariffs don't, what people pay for the services don't necessarily cover the O&M costs. And sustainability is quite low. A lot of municipalities, as many of you know, a lot of countries have been going through decentralization and devolution processes. A lot of these are new municipalities, new towns, and they can't quite keep up with a growing demand and cannot quite manage the services. So those are some tough things that we're thinking about. And in the case of Mozambique, there's high piped water coverage in large urban areas in general through piped household connections and standpipes, but very low in rural and small towns. So in secondary cities, and there are about 130 of them, only 25% have access to the network through household connections that many of us have and standpipes. And in some cases, it's 10% or lower. So since 2005, actually, through a World Bank program, the country piloted three water systems to be managed by private operators. And so there's no private sector investment. It's literally just operating and managing the system after the World Bank had invested some money and the government tendered it out and essentially contracted the operations and management of it. So fast forward to now, 2021, there are 50 secondary cities and towns managed by private operators under PPP contracts, or what we call lease affirmage contracts in Mozambique. And there's been an increase in terms of the percentage of population with access to piped water, but expansion is quite limited, partly because of the way the contracts are, but also there's just not enough funds for large capital investment costs. So it's been a great solution to actually try and expand services. So in the towns where I've worked, for instance, we've seen access go from 10% to 30, 40, 50%. I know this doesn't sound like a lot because we're still not at universal access and we're still not getting water services for 24 hours. But that's a step in the right direction. And that's really how we need to start looking at private sector engagement. They can't solve everything, but they can start providing some of the essential services that are needed. And so, next slide, please. So this is a bit of a complicated graphic, but I did want to share that what we're doing now is we're supporting those private operators and the government agency that are contracting those private operators to think through, how do you improve this relationship with the private sector? How do you get towards more participation of private sector? So if you look at the graphic, I won't explain all of it, but basically it goes from left to right, more public investments, more public responsibilities towards, if you go to the right-hand side of the graph in red, more private investments. You get the private sector to design, to build infrastructure. You get them to operate that as well. And they can have a concession contract for 20, 30 years. So how do you think about it in those terms where we've been experimenting in this subsegment of secondary towns or cities for a while now, over 15 years, to think about, okay, how do you then increase private sector participation and what are the regulatory arrangements and institutional arrangements needed for that? And what does the private sector need? It could be as easy as helping them with a feasibility study to understand these are really the socioeconomic constraints. These are some of the opportunities. We've also been supporting negotiating of some of these contracts. So, and that's just not in Mozambique. We've also done that in South Africa. We've helped renegotiate a contract in, I don't know if some of you are familiar with Nelspruit municipality towards the border of South Africa and Mozambique. And so that's just a little bit of a teaser in this space. Next slide, please. So case number 2, please don't get sick of it yet, but this really provides a lesson for us in terms of, back to what Judith was saying, I didn't quite capture which slide it was, but when she talked about the dynamism of the informal private sector and how do you accommodate for that, right? So in Mozambique, there are 1,800 private water providers throughout the country, serving peri-urban areas, around 25% of the urban population. They're not going away. So the attitude has been, just leave them alone. There are a few hundred back in the early 2000s when I first started working there. They'll go away. You've got large investments in large urban systems. Pretty soon they'll disappear. That's what happened in Manila when the Manila water concession happened in the early 2000s. You've got a lot of private housing developments in Manila actually providing private water provision in their subdivisions in the Metro Manila area. And then over time, the Manila Water, the operator, the water utility, was able to provide services to these areas. So the thinking was, well, this will happen as well in Mozambique. Well, why is it that now, in the 2011, this is a bit dated, but 2021 timeframe, you've got tons. You've got almost 2,000 of these because it's not enough. And so then the question lies, how do you then incorporate that in the formal delivery system? And so how do we make sure that we have a citywide inclusive water service provision that also incorporates the services of these? Oh, next slide, please. And so USAID for a number of years now has been supporting the National Directorate of Water Supply and Sanitation in developing and implementing a licensing and regulatory framework. Probably doesn't sound as impressive here. As you'll see, there are 92 licenses issued with another 111 in the process. I think the key thing I want to bring up here is licensing itself is not the only solution. If you look at Manila, you look at Delhi, you look at other places in the world, not every private provider has to be licensed and has to be formalized. And there needs to be careful thinking about how that process is, who needs to be licensed, who needs to be formalized, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then also just part of our work is facilitating a better understanding of their contribution. They've invested probably over 30, 40 million dollars in the sector. It doesn't look like a lot, but they serve almost 1 million people or more than 1 million people in the country. And lastly, providing capacity building. That's one of the pieces of work we're doing, improving technical and financial management, looking at business planning and business expansion to help some of them get access to finance. Not all 1,800 of them will get there, but a subset, an important subset that serves thousands of people can actually get some kind of financing, a blend of grants and loans. And next slide, please. So that's still in the same country continent now, moving to Asia, case 3, Cambodia. So in Cambodia, it's quite interesting because it's very similar to the example I just provided. Again, you've got these almost, basically these private water providers, again, putting in their savings, family savings, and basically sinking in their investments into developing these decentralized pipe networks. And they're actually the sole providers of piped water supply outside the largest cities. So they've been serving the secondary cities, small towns, covering 60% of the population in Cambodia. Again, when I first started working there, it's about maybe 300, 600, about 300 that we identified. Fast forward to today, there are about 700, 800 of them around in Cambodia. They have not gone away. And so one key thing here in terms of really integrating them into the complex web of water service delivery is being able to help to increase their license terms, being able to provide that security. Judith talked about security of tenure, but that's for the households, right? In this case, it's the security for these private sector players to actually operate. Why will they expand? How can we even count on them to expand and improve services if they think that next year the city government or the town mayor or someone in their neighborhood will just say, you can't expand, you can't operate here anymore. So being able to provide that confidence in this case has been able to help these private water operators attract future investments and attract finance. So I'll show you in the next slide. Oh, next slide, please. That we've been able to mobilize almost 3 million in domestic bank loans since 2017. It doesn't sound as impressive, but if you think about that in local currencies, these loans are about $150, $200, $300,000, they're peanuts, but that's actually the missing middle in the sector. Those smaller transactions are what's needed just to move the envelope with some of these private water providers. And so we've been helping prepare business plans, facilitating dialogue with financial institutions. Judith talked about affordable housing and the different pieces. And who's the private sector? Financial institutions are a huge part of them, and they don't even understand the sector. They don't even think there's an opportunity because it's seen as risky. So being able to talk to these institutions is important to present the opportunities. And the next slide, please. I'll go fast as I think I'm taking up too much time. So last one, back to Africa. This case is Senegal and sanitation. Combined 65% of urban had access to to safely manage or basic sanitation services. And there's actually a long history of private sector participation in water and sanitation in Senegal, particularly in water. So you have that business and enabling environment there already going on for more than a decade. And so we found about 100 private sanitation providers, and think of it as 4 large ones, maybe 5 sanitation providers. And then the rest of them are 2 guys in a truck, or a couple, a mom and dad, mom and pop in a truck, emptying latrines and providing fecal sludge management services. And so next, please. So those are the providers that we've been working with. And we've mobilized $2 million in domestic bank loans since 2017, plus an additional 4 to 5 million right now in terms of blended finance, basically combining grants and loans. We understand that the 2 guys in a truck, they can't afford a bank financing that's in double digit with interest rates of double digits. So how do you buy down the interest rates? How do you help people access more affordable financing to expand their business? It's really important. And I won't read through all of this, but really what a key lesson for us is, aside from helping these providers strengthen their governance and financial management, create business plans, access to finance, important thing is government. The government commitment to actually help with market creation. Just because private sector is there doesn't mean the government doesn't have a role. And private sector really thrives when you have a government entity or entities helping create that market, at least in this case. So in Senegal, they've been actively working on tenders, public tenders, so that some of these sanitation providers can bid. So that public and private relationship is really crucial in expanding and scaling up the services in that part of the sanitation value chain. Next slide, please. And so I will stop there. There are many more stories that I'm excited to tell you more about, but I just wanted to share some of our select publications. We have those technical series that you'll find in Global Waters. And then WashFin is a program I manage. It's a $50 million program to help mobilize public funds and private finance in the sector, and to work with utilities and wash providers. And we're coming up with country briefs to actually outline our reflections and lessons on what we've been doing. And so these are just 3 of them, and we have a few more coming out soon. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Ella. That was fantastic. 2 fantastic presentations, Judith and Ella, and I'm sure lots of burning comments and questions that we will now take up in the breakout rooms. Jamal, could you please help facilitate? I guess we're going to have a pop-up now requesting for folks to choose a breakout room. Click on so you see a breakout rooms icon showing up at the bottom. Pick the room that you want to be in. We'll spend the next 35 minutes there and come back. So we'll see you in the rooms that you choose.
I'm glad that everyone had a good session, and I'm sure that everybody is very interested in hearing the results from the other room, so to speak. Let me ask Judith to maybe just do her quick impressions of the discussion we had on affordable housing, and then we'll turn after that to Ella.
Thank you, David. It's hard to capture the really engaging discussion that we had on an already rather complex subject. But what was very interesting to me is that we had a consensus, I believe, that it's not just the private sector, but within a broader frame, and that government and private sector each have their role to play, who does what well. And we didn't focus a lot on civil society, but I would also include that. We also agreed that the access to land and the security of tenure is critical. And one person offered the idea of land banking, and we didn't delve into the complexities of that or land availability for housing, but that is really one of the key elements. And we did explore a bit the role of housing, affordable housing in social inclusion and in inequality. A couple of things that were mentioned and specific to that were the use of existing stock, and then the planning for land use, which I guess land banking would be a portion or a subset of that, is very, very important. We had within our group somebody who is coming from the commercial private sector perspective, who's had to leave us unfortunately, but made some very useful contributions about capturing in one word, perhaps what others I was trying to do in the word probability. And so certainty for the private sector investment, understanding what the quote unquote rules are and being able to depend upon them, win-win, which is I think also a theme that ran through much of the discussion. And so, risk and regulation are things that private sector, and we were talking here more about the kind of the developer side of it, but also the finance. And we concluded our discussion to develop a well-functioning housing sector, which includes affordable housing, but not only, is how understanding the different forms of tenure, rental housing, other forms as well, and how do the actors work together, and how is there finance that is available to the informal sector, and adapted financial products, which could also form as a way to accommodate formal and informal sector, the example being given of microfinance for housing, but there and other instruments as well. So we had a very rich discussion of different examples, but with the consensus that everyone, it takes a village, everyone has a role to play, and that when those roles are delineated and the incentives aligned, that is when there will be greater private sector involvement and engagement in affordable housing delivery.
Thank you, Judith. Ella, do you want to give us your thoughts on the discussion in your breakout session?
Sure. That was very well done, Judith. Not sure I can rise up to the occasion here. So from our team, we had a really good, robust discussion in a bunch of topics, and I'll just try to capture it in 3. So the first one actually involves metrics and KPIs. And so as we think about service models that include the private sector, what about increasing equity and quality of services, and how can that be captured in our KPIs? Just because the private sector is there, is it really delivering services to those that need it the most or that are underserved? And how do we do that and kind of go beyond the numbers as well? And so there was a question on how Usaid is committed to doing, we're committed to doing it. How are we doing it now? We still have our standard indicators that many of you folks who've been implementing partners know, but internally, we are really trying to move the needle on looking at the actual overall WASH systems and taking a more systems approach and understanding, okay, well, year 1, this is where we are, and this is our vision for the sector, and it's not always going to be numbers, but how do you spin that narrative so that still looks like you're making some progress? Telling the story of policy reform, regulation, governance is not often easy. And so definitely that's something that we're working on, and some of the partners in the group are also working on. The second point is on regulation. So it's related to the housing discussion, really important, especially when private sector is involved, to have a strong regulatory framework, a clear framework for rules of game. What are the rules of the game so that we can provide some security for the private sector and also provide some incentives for them to further expand. It's no longer the case where we turn to the private sector because there's a failure in services, but it's also, as Dennis Mwanza mentioned, but it's changing. There's also interest in private sector to help with just improving operations, reducing cost of production and other things. And lastly, really the importance of capacity strengthening. We talk about private sector, but what about how do you manage their quality of service? How do you manage what they're doing in their performance? So it's important to look at capacity strengthening, both of the private sector and also the public sector. And that's something that USAID has been committed to doing and supporting more of in the coming years. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Deepa, did you want to add anything to that? I didn't have anything to add to Judith, I must say.
Well, that was such a lovely summary, Ella. The only thing that, and from one of the points that Ellen made, and something that I've personally been fascinated about is this innovation in governance in terms of just bringing different stakeholders, like let's say in the context of a country, bringing a utility, a regulator, a ministry, and some of the private sector associations to visualize trade-offs from the decisions. Just, I think, and thinking about just, and I know these are complex things that can, but thinking about agile ways in which one can facilitate such processes so that people can come together to think about either new investment decisions or plans in sort of in a more holistic way was, I think, a fascinating point that Ellen made. And I just wanted to, I was excited about that. Finding good ways to operationalize that in the real world is tricky, but it's a fascinating idea around systems change. Maybe the researcher in me, but yes, I just wanted to just add that and put that out there as something that would be lovely to talk more about and see where we can go. But that's it. That's a fantastic summary. Thank you, Ella and Judith.
Well, let me thank both Ella and Judith for, I think, some really wonderful discussion that we had in both of our sessions. And at this point, we're reaching the end of our time, so I wanted to hand it over to Sid again. I think, Paul, if you're on, you wanted to make a few comments and notations to people who participated. So I'll hand it to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, David, and thanks, Deepa and Ella and Judith for your time. That was a great event from what I heard based on the conversations and your overviews just now. Just as a final wrap up, we posted, if we haven't done so already, we will be posting a survey link in the chat box momentarily. So please feel free to fill that out. We really do take your feedback into consideration when we go and try to plan our events in the future. So that's something we do very much take into consideration. It's not something that we take lightly. So feel free to fill that out. And in the, just also too, because the question has been coming up in the chat box a little bit, at least earlier on, we will ask all the speakers, we'll ask Judith and Ella if they would like to share their presentations with all of you and publicly. I'm not sure if there are any stipulations we need to follow there, but we'll follow up with the speakers and we will keep you posted on that. And with that, thank you for your time. We appreciate it. And we will look forward, hopefully see you at future SID-W events and hopefully maybe the conference. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.